Hello, and welcome to the launch of this important research collaboration between Reconciliation Australia and the University of New South Wales. But first, today I'm speaking to you from Gadigal country, and I would like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land, airs and waterways here, and of wherever the 1,900 of you who registered are joining from today. And I pay my sincere respect to elders past and present. I also pay my respect to all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people joining us today. My name's Dr. Penny Taylor, and I'm the Manager of Research and Development in the Community Truth-Telling Program at Reconciliation Australia. The report that we will hear about today is entitled Coming to Terms with the Past, Identifying Barriers and Enablers to Truth-Telling and Strategies to Promote Historical Acceptance. This is a report for our times. Now more than ever, we need truth-telling and we need information and education about truth-telling. So today we're going to hear from the researchers and report authors, Professor Heidi Norman and Dr. Maree Payne, who'll present the key findings of their research. And we will also hear from two community members who participated in that research about the work they are doing to advance truth-telling in their local communities. But first, we'll hear from Karen Mundine, CEO of Reconciliation Australia, who will outline the central role of truth-telling in reconciliation and speak to why Reconciliation Australia commissioned this important research.
Jingiwali and good afternoon. Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us here today, and thank you, Penny, for guiding us through today's launch. Today, I'm also joining you from the lands of the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation, also known as Sydney. I'd also like to acknowledge and pay respects to Gadigal elders, those of today and yesterday, who have kept these stories alive and provided guidance and wisdom. I also would like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the lands from which all of you are joining us today. Now, given that we are here talking about truth-telling, we cannot talk about Gadigal country without emphasising that it was also the site of ground zero for colonisation. It's one of the first places where Aboriginal people and the colonisers came into relationship with one another. And that set the scene for so much of what was to unfold across the rest of the nation. However, these lands are, were, and always will be characterised by Gadigal history, culture, and strength from before and after colonisation. Now, these foundational truths underscore why we acknowledge country and why we pay respect to the resilience and the guidance of elders. Another truth that we've learned last year after the referendum was the urgent need for truth-telling and education on Australia's past. Truth-telling is crucial for all Australians to appreciate our shared histories and understand how these histories manifest in our relationships, communities, and institutions today. Now, truth-telling has always been at the heart of reconciliation, and it will continue to be a keystone of our mission to create a more just and equitable Australia. As the Australian Declaration Towards Reconciliation that was released in the year 2000 says, our nation must have the courage to own the truth, to heal the wounds of its past so that we can move on together at peace with ourselves. At its heart, reconciliation is about strengthening relationships between Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples and non-Indigenous Australians for the benefit of all of us. And of course, this relationship cannot function without a shared and honest understanding of where we've come from. Now, our work of reconciliation is based on and measured by 5 dimensions of reconciliation. They are race relations, equality and equity, institutional integrity, unity, and of course, historical acceptance. Now, when we talk about historical acceptance, that means that all Australians recognise, understand, and accept the wrongs of the past and the impact of these wrongs on First Peoples. Consequently, knowing what gets people engaged in truth-telling and also what prevents them is absolutely key to our progress in reconciliation. Now, I am extremely proud to be part of this launch and launch this report, coming to terms with the past, identifying barriers and enablers to truth-telling and strategies to promote historical acceptance. This landmark research explores attitudes towards barriers to and enablers of truth-telling in Australia. And it's been brought to life by the exceptional work of Dr. Maree Payne and Professor Heidi Norman from the Indigenous Land and Justice Research Group from the University of New South Wales, and in collaboration with us at Reconciliation Australia. It shows us that while truth-telling is an everyday activity for many First Nations peoples, for non-Indigenous Australians, they're unsure about how to get involved. And this just backs up the data that we have in our latest Australian Reconciliation Barometer, which also shows that while 84% of the general community believe that knowing about the histories of First Peoples is important, only 6% of those non-Indigenous people had participated in a truth-telling activity in the previous 12 months. This new research from UNSW adds detail to this picture, allowing us to see where obstacles to truth-telling persist and why fundamental truths about our country are not pervasive in the broader public. The more information we have on this picture, the better we'll be able to approach coming to terms with our past, not so that we just move on and get over it, but so that we can move forward together. Because truth-telling is not about being divisive and creating divisions, as some would suggest. It is about a movement that seeks to bring us closer together. And while telling the truth about our history brings to light colonial conflict and dispossession, it also shows us all the strengths and immense contributions of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples and cultures. This research, coming to terms with the past, is a significant piece of work on our journey towards ensuring all Australians are knowledgeable and engaged in the facets of our shared history. Reconciliation Australia is very proud to be associated with this work. I congratulate everyone who has contributed, and I commend this report to anyone that wants to contribute to advancing truth-telling in Australia. Thank you.
Thank you, Karen. Karen Mundine, CEO of Reconciliation Australia. Now I'd like to introduce Professor Leanne Holt to make some opening remarks on behalf of the University of New South Wales, from where the research team comes from. Professor Holt is a Worimi Biripi woman from the mid-coast of New South Wales. She is the inaugural Deputy Vice-Chancellor Indigenous at the University of New South Wales, and she has also served as the inaugural Pro-Vice-Chancellor Indigenous Strategy at Macquarie University and co-director of the Wallapuka Institute at the University of Newcastle, among her many contributions to Indigenous higher education over the past 25 years. I'm so pleased to welcome Professor Holt to make some remarks from the university.
Thank you, Penny, and my apologies for being late on. I had technical trouble. Wayabu nyada Leanne Holt wara mai birabai galbang. Gudi yugu nyada nyura marang bijigu baragu. And to pay respect to this land and this bijigu country. Wanyamba, Wanyambu, Ganyala. Always this land has cared for thousands of years as it's cared for us. Wanyambu, Wanyambu, Ganyai. Always will be in the future. Garai Ninyang, Ginyang, we make that commitment together. On behalf of UNSW, I welcome you here today, and I thank you for your interest and engagement with such important work. I take this opportunity to acknowledge Professor Heidi Norman and Dr. Maree Payne from the Indigenous Land and Justice Research Group, School of Humanities and Languages at UNSW, authors of this report, Coming to Terms with the Past, Identifying Barriers Enablers to Truth-Telling and Strategies to Promote Historical Acceptance. The report is so crucial for redirecting our futures in an empowering way. Community-based truth-telling and promoting engagement with Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander histories is such an essential aspect of Australia's future journey towards the recognition and future empowerment of First Nations Australia. It is fitting that UNSW is a host for this event, with Reconciliation Australia, as a strong advocate for the Uluru Statement where truth forms a critical pillar. Congratulations also to Karen Mundine and Reconciliation Australia for commissioning this important work, recognising the significance of this work towards a more socially just future. I really enjoyed looking at the different aspects of the report, which highlights that while truth-telling is an everyday activity for many First Nations people, non-Indigenous Australians are uncertain about what truth-telling involves and unclear about what their role in truth-telling is. This research emphasises the strong views that truth-telling should be led by First Nations people and should bring First Nations and non-Indigenous Australians together in an ongoing dialogue which aims to achieve change. Identifying the barriers to and enablings of truth-telling, it helps community truth-telling practitioners to design and deliver more effective truth-telling initiatives that will engage a wider cross-section of the community. The research aligns very strongly with UNSW's strategic priority to undertake research with real-world impact. I am confident that the findings of this report will inform the work of the many committed supporters of reconciliation who work tirelessly in our communities throughout Australia to improve outcomes for First Nations people and to achieve the vision of a more empowered Australia. I look forward to hearing from our panellists, Uncle Gary and Tess and Meehan, who are already ambassadors of truth-telling within their communities. And again, on behalf of UNSW, thank you for being here and engaging with this important work. I hope it will inspire you to be part of the movement that the report calls for. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Holt. Professor Leanne Holt, Deputy Vice-Chancellor, University of New South Wales. Now, let's delve into the research with its authors. Professor Heidi Norman is a leading researcher in the field of Australian Aboriginal political history. She has published widely on histories of Aboriginal land rights, Aboriginal participation in rugby league, studies of media representation, the history of Aboriginal working life in cities, and political history of Aboriginal affairs administration. Her family are from Gomeroi lands of northwestern New South Wales. Dr. Maree Payne is an historian with significant professional experience and expertise in the human rights field. Her work has a strong focus on applied research with real-world application. A non-Indigenous Australian, Maree has worked in partnership with First Nations people on employment, education, research, and reconciliation initiatives for more than 30 years. Thank you, Heidi and Maree.
Thank you, Penny. Thank you all for your interest in our work and participation today. I add my acknowledgement and respect to the Bidjigal people where I am today. I'll move straight into the research, talking about the research. And as you have heard with my colleague, Dr. Maree Payne, we set out to identify the barriers and enablers to truth-telling. The intention of our work is to inform how truth-telling can be progressed. And like many of us, last October was a bruising and took some time to regroup. But I am committed to thinking really about truth-telling and what we can do in this space, for obvious reasons. So to talk about the research, we went about this research by reading what had been written about truth-telling. We then examined how the media reports truth-telling, and we gathered information about attitudes to truth-telling in Australia via a survey and interviews. And later in this session, you'll hear from some of the terrific people who participated and contributed to the research. Drawing on these elements, we found three leading approaches to truth-telling, and I'm going to explain those three leading approaches and the extra that we have added. So we believe this schema is useful, these three approaches to truth-telling. They're useful to assist us think about the wide range of initiatives and events currently taking place in Australia under the umbrella of truth-telling. As I make my way through these three approaches, you will notice the interconnections between these categories. And this schema, we hope, also helps to distinguish what cannot meaningfully be described as truth-telling. Let me explain these three approaches. So the first, as you can see here, is truth-telling, rights and justice. So to explain this a little bit further, this approach to truth-telling it's the prominent meaning of truth-telling in the 21st century. This approach to truth-telling is usually undertaken on a larger scale. It's intrinsically connected to justice. It's informed by human rights frameworks, and it aims to address systemic injustice at an institutional level. And examples of this approach to truth-telling include the South African Truth and Reconciliation Commission, the Bringing Them Home report that goes back to 1996, and more recent example, I think, we could look to the Yurok Justice Commission. The second approach that we identified is truth-telling to promote reconciliation and healing. And this is most likely to occur at local and community level. It's based on the understanding that relationships and dialogue can bring about change. This approach is less likely to be tied to formal outcomes or reparations, and more likely to be associated with healing. Examples of this might include the work of the Healing Foundation, acts of acknowledgement and recognition. It might include memorialization, plaques, renaming of places. The third, and this is sort of, I guess, a real focus of my work, is truth-telling as history. And in this work, what I think we would say is that a greater understanding of the past will assist in coming to terms with its legacies and what that means to live in Australia today. There are some complexities here. So the reality is that, I would argue, the work to restore Aboriginal worlds omitted from the national story, those silences, has largely been done. Of course, there's more to be undertaken, but that's largely done. But what we might think about critically is that hearing as a barrier to knowing persists. The other dimension of truth-telling as history is this. First Nations history extends beyond the 200 plus years of colonisation to many thousands of generations. Appreciating this much longer history opens a much deeper and much longer connection to place and the possibility of inheritance of this ancient land, unique in the world. In addition to the three approaches to truth-telling, we add a fourth, and that is truth-telling practice, or the doing of truth-telling. The how-to of truth-telling is key. And the strong consensus emerging from our research, and that what we heard Professor Holt refer to just now, is that our research showed that participants said truth-telling in Australia must be led by Aboriginal people and communities and engage with First Nations perspectives. It needs to recognise the ongoing impacts of the past on First Nations people's lives today. It can't be a one-off event, and it must necessarily aim to achieve change. So just to confirm there, we have emphasised, we think our schema is useful in helping us to understand what is truth-telling, and perhaps importantly, to understand clearly what falls outside of truth-telling. I'll hand over to Maree now, who will share the research findings and implications for truth-telling at the community level.
Thanks very much, Heidi. And I would also like to pay my respects and acknowledge the Bidjigal people whose lands I'm joining you from today, to pay my respects to elders past and present, and to acknowledge all First Nations people attending today's webinar. And just a general thank you to everyone for making the time to come along today. It's great to be able to share our research findings with you. So a striking feature emerging from our research, as Heidi has mentioned, was the sheer diversity of activities that are currently conceived of as truth-telling in Australia. However, there was widespread agreement amongst the participants in our study about some key principles which should inform truth-telling in Australia. These were that truth-telling should be led by First Nations peoples and communities and engage with First Nations perspectives. That truth-telling is not just about the past. There's a need to recognise the ongoing impacts of the past on First Nations peoples' lives today. Truth-telling is best conceived of as a process of dialogue and engagement rather than as a one-off event. So something I would say to participants is, how is your activity going to contribute to that broader dialogue? Both First Nations and non-Indigenous people want truth-telling to achieve change. It's not just a talk fest. There was strong support for local truth-telling, with similar numbers of First Nations and non-Indigenous people wanting truth-telling to take place locally in their local community. However, 87% of First Nations respondents wanted truth-telling to be about their local community. So not just happen in their community, but be about their local community, compared to 60% of non-Indigenous people. So what can truth-telling achieve? While there were some key differences between First Nations and non-Indigenous respondents in terms of the outcomes they are seeking from truth-telling, there was also a strong consensus in their hope that truth-telling would develop a shared understanding of Australian history, help to deliver healing for First Nations peoples, contribute to a more just future for First Nations peoples, and improve relationships between First Nations and non-Indigenous peoples. In terms of barriers to First Nations participation in truth-telling, 69% of First Nations respondents indicated that the fear of experiencing distress or trauma might be a barrier to their participation in truth-telling, or were neutral or unsure about whether trauma would prevent their participation. While both First Nations and non-Indigenous people wanted truth-telling to contribute to healing, as one interviewee commented, trauma just doesn't go away the next day because you talked about it. It's a lifelong burden you carry, and it's just how you deal with it on a day-to-day basis, which is the issue. Organisers of truth-telling activities need to ensure appropriate support is provided for participants who may be impacted by trauma. The existence of trauma makes issues of cultural safety in truth-telling critical. 72% of First Nations respondents indicated that concerns about cultural safety might be a barrier to their participation in truth-telling, or were neutral or unsure about this aspect. 67% of First Nations respondents were concerned that participants might question or challenge the accuracy of the truths being shared, or were neutral or unsure about whether this issue would prevent their participation in truth-telling. And I think, as Heidi's outlined, these are legitimate concerns, as history in Australia has often been heavily contested and politicised. Differing perspectives about what happened in the past are highly likely to be part of truth-telling conversations. So being open to different opinions, being able to disagree respectfully and to engage with multiple perspectives on the past are important skills truth-telling participants will need to develop. While they wanted truth-telling to build a shared understanding of the past, First Nations people were much more concerned than non-Indigenous people that truth-telling had the potential to create conflict and to emphasise the divisions and differences between First Nations and non-Indigenous Australians. This was possibly due to First Nations people's greater awareness of the range of challenging and confronting truths that might be shared. Participants also recognise that truth-telling has the potential to create tensions and conflict within and between First Nations peoples and communities. And finally, First Nations people were far more likely to have concerns about the accuracy of the truths being shared via truth-telling. They were 3 times more likely to be concerned about truth-telling, making them feel ashamed or guilty than non-Indigenous people, something that I found very surprising. First Nations people were also much more likely to agree that it was important that truth-telling was supported by historical evidence. And I think these findings relating to accuracy and documentation may reflect the reality that there is a lot at stake for First Nations people in truth-telling. In terms of enablers, First Nations people were highly motivated to participate in truth-telling, to celebrate the resilience and survival of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples, to show their personal support for First Nations people, to share their own personal or family history and perspective, and to focus on truth-telling about their local community. 100% of First Nations respondents expected truth-telling to include First Nations perspectives on the past being presented. Overwhelmingly, they also wanted the diversity of First Nations people to be recognised and wanted truth-telling to result in change, in both behaviours and attitudes towards First Nations people. So addressing these expectations in your truth-telling activities will ensure that First Nations peoples will be motivated to participate and are more likely to find their participation meaningful. Moving on to barriers and enablers for non-Indigenous people, the non-Indigenous people in our study indicated significant uncertainty about how to participate in truth-telling. Over 60% of non-Indigenous respondents indicated that a lack of knowledge about how to get involved in truth-telling would be a barrier to their participation, or that they were neutral or unsure about whether it might be. And these were non-Indigenous people who otherwise saw themselves as very knowledgeable and supportive about First Nations issues. So this really highlights the need to educate the wider population about what truth-telling is and how you can get involved. Lack of clarity about the role of non-Indigenous people in truth-telling processes was a barrier, with 46% of non-Indigenous respondents indicating uncertainty about their role, or that they were neutral or unsure about whether this would prevent their participation. Although a lower proportion of non-Indigenous respondents than First Nations people were concerned that participants in truth-telling might challenge the accuracy of the truths being shared or had concerns about cultural safety, anxieties about these issues were identified as barriers to participation by a number of non-Indigenous participants. Non-Indigenous people also mentioned educational barriers, emotional barriers, including feelings of discomfort, guilt, and avoidance, the view that it's all in the past, racism and white privilege, a sense of powerlessness and futility, and the politicisation of Aboriginal history as barriers to truth-telling participation. In terms of enablers, non-Indigenous people were highly motivated to participate in truth-telling to show their personal support for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples, to learn more about the ongoing impacts of the past on Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples today, to learn more about the resilience and survival of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples, and to learn how to contribute to reconciliation. So there's a lot of goodwill out there and a willingness to learn. Non-Indigenous interviewees identified a number of factors which had led them personally to engage, including the power of hearing, the personal experience of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples, developing personal friendships with First Nations people, positive educational experiences, place-based learning, engaging with Indigenous authored texts and research, gaining access to information in a safe place, in the right place and time, learning through the arts and material culture, and through their own personal experiences of racism and prejudice. In terms of what we learned about truth-telling processes, both First Nations and non-Indigenous people want clear information to be provided about how to participate appropriately in truth-telling. The need for all participants to listen respectfully to the information being shared by Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples was widely recognised. There was a strong desire expressed among our research participants for truth-telling to be interactive, with 81% of First Nations respondents and 61% of non-Indigenous respondents agreeing that all participants in truth-telling should be able to share their perspectives. Although it's worth noting here that over a third of non-Indigenous respondents were neutral about or disagreed with this. There was also strong support for some form of formal acknowledgement of the truths that are shared, for example, by a local dignitary or government representative at a truth-telling event. In terms of our key take-out messages about truth-telling practices, truth-telling must be First Nations-led. There is no truth-telling without First Nations people. Don't assume that people in your community will know what truth-telling is. You need to educate people about truth-telling. Truth-telling has more resonance if it's seen to be inclusive of diversity and incorporating a range of different perspectives. Clearly explain what truth-telling processes you are using and what you are hoping to achieve. For example, is it an interactive session or are you delivering content for people to listen to? Establish protocols about your expectations about participants' behaviour and remember to communicate and enforce these. Actively consider cultural safety issues. Participating in truth-telling might be painful for some, cause discomfort for others, and conflict might arise. How will you handle this, and what support will you provide during and after? Not everything will always go according to plan. But that's okay. Mistakes are our teachers for next time. And perhaps most importantly, truth-telling is as much about the future as about the past. So while acknowledging the challenges, it's important to remain optimistic about the possibilities for change. Before I hand back to Penny, I just wanted to send a huge thank you out to everyone who gave generously of their time by participating in this research. We really appreciate your input. Thank you so much to everyone at Reconciliation Australia for their support for this project. They've been great to work with. And a big thank you to Dr. Sam Delgado and Mr. Jordan Itoyu, who contributed to the research. Thanks, Penny, and back to you.
Thank you, Heidi and Anne-Marie. Thank you very much. This brief overview gives us a glimpse of the rich and important insights arising from this research. And if you'd like to learn more, the full report is available now on the Reconciliation Australia website, reconciliation.org.au, alongside a shorter report of a brief high-level overview of the findings. So I'm delighted now to be able to bring some of the voices of that report into this event. Uncle Gary Matthews and Tess Meehan are among those who were interviewed as part of this research. And they're just two of the growing numbers of people who are finding diverse ways to play their part in truth-telling across Australia. They are both committed to advancing truth-telling in their local communities. And today they will share the insights and experience they have gained from their ongoing efforts. Uncle Gary Matthews is a proud Aboriginal man from the lands of the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation. He was the Chief Executive Officer of Coffs Harbour Aboriginal Family Community Care Centre Aboriginal Corporation, ABCARE, for 27 years, and the Executive Director of Strait National Peak for over 20 years. He was also a foundation member and treasurer with ABSEC, the New South Wales State Secretariat Peak, for over 20 years. He has served on many New South Wales ministerials over the decades, including Child Protection, Health, and NDIS. Tess Meehan was born and raised on Dunghutti country in Kempsey. She works as a teacher and careers advisor in a secondary school on the Macleay. She teaches human society in its environment curriculum, which includes HSC Aboriginal Studies. And she has previously served the Kempsey Shire Council as a youth and engagement officer and is a member of many sporting and community groups in her local community. Welcome to you both. So you're both working hard to advance truth-telling in your local communities in different ways. And I wanted to ask, what approaches have you had success with? If you'd like to start first, Uncle Gary. Oh, you're on mute, Uncle Gary. We seem to be having some technical difficulties. I'll just mention while Uncle Gary's sorting that out at his end, in addition to the report, there was also a fabulous piece in the conversation today from Heidi and Anne-Marie that really nicely summarises a lot of what the report covers, and I encourage you to check it out on the conversation site after this webinar. Just wondering how... Uncle Gary, while you're sorting that out, maybe we'll throw to Tess to talk to her experiences, and you can join us as soon as we've got that audio working. It's such a pity it was working earlier. Just for now, Tess, can you tell us a little bit about some of the approaches you've had success with?
Thank you, Penny. And as you said, I'm coming to you from Dunghutti country. So I acknowledge the elders here as our original teachers, probably our best teachers, and hoping to follow in their footsteps as well. And recognise that I get to teach and learn from our future elders here as well. I think the stuff that I'm doing here in the Macleay is mostly based at school, and it's trying to get more of these views and this truth-telling within our curriculum. and getting the curriculum into school earlier on. I think from my own experience, I went to school here, primary and high school, and it wasn't until I went to university that I knew about the massacres here in Crescent Head. So looking at trying to share that information in class based on curriculum so that we can acknowledge that and our students can learn that before they get to 20 at university and have that conversation. I think where I'm seeing a lot of success is having those conversations at school and our students then having those conversations at home around their dinner table and encourage them sharing the narrative with them about how to have those conversations in a really respectful way with parents and grandparents that may not be entirely ready to hear some of the stories coming out of truth telling. Our students here are really blessed to have access to the Kinchler Boys Home and our uncles there. So we quite often have those uncles at school. And I think that information coming from them and then being shared at home, and then often those parents going to work and sharing with their colleagues is where we're seeing success locally here. And I guess I relate it to when we started doing that recycling message, and I know my own children are like, that doesn't go in that bin, Mum. And I know that seems like a long bow to draw, but I think that is what's happening. There's a lot of calling out on different narratives that are untrue in our local area by our students, by our young people having access to our uncles and books and journal articles. I know my own students have used Heidi's journal articles in their HSC major projects just this year. So that's where we're seeing some success. I know that our local school network also have, I guess, begun this truth telling as well with our AEWs, which is our Aboriginal education workers. We do training for them in crossing cultures, hidden histories. And a lot of our local AEWs have spoken about, like I said, with going to uni, not having that information until they went to this training. So I guess that's what we're doing within our education setting, and we're having hopefully some success. Certainly more to do.
Yes, thanks, Tess. And so it sounds like one of the other things that I wanted to ask you about was a little bit about what motivates you to put your time and energy into this. You've touched on the fact that you were deprived of this information yourself growing up, as was I. What is it that drives you now to share this truth?
Well, I still live here. I've moved back here. I'll be here forevermore. My children are growing up here. My nieces and nephew that identify as Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander are growing up here, and they need this. This has to happen for them. Yeah, that's what motivates me.
Yeah, and I suppose alongside that question is the idea of what are the benefits you see flowing from truth telling. I mean, you've talked about this beautiful ripple effect of when you teach stuff in the classroom and when the stories are shared by the uncles with the children and the students, it's going back home. But what are the benefits that you see from people having this knowledge and understanding and access to this information?
I think there's more acceptance then of the disparities sometimes between our communities here, and more understanding of that intergenerational stuff that's happening for some families that might function really differently to you, and understanding how that's come about for them through the history that we've shared together but experienced really differently. So yeah.
Thanks, Tess. And so just delving a little deeper into the opportunity that you have specifically in your community with the uncles that you talked about, can you tell us a little bit more about what that looks like and how it works?
One, I guess, great thing is that our uncles are now travelling everywhere, all over New South Wales, to do truth telling and to talk about their past and share that so generously with everybody, which means they're not here as often. But I think that's great that they can share that as well. But what happens is they come into our school, they have the most wonderful video of, and it's a you know, it's a drawn video of their experiences, and there's no talking to that video, and it goes for about 10 minutes, and that's really powerful for our students every time they see that. So hearing those, or seeing those truths, and then seeing those faces that are attached to this video that you've just watched, and often being quite shocked by that truth telling that our students see, but in, I guess, an appropriate way, I guess, is that the right word, for students to engage with that. And then hearing how that video they've just watched was real life for our uncles that experienced that, and then the flow-on effect for what happened because of that that upbringing or lack of upbringing that they experienced. So that's really powerful. Our students sit in that space with our uncles for the day, and keep having those conversations. I think that's possibly because that's what I've experienced. That's what I see truth telling as. And then we have ongoing programs, because Kinchela Boys Home, although based in Sydney, still have arms and programs happening here. So our cultural groups continue to engage with those employees within Kinchela Boys Home as well. So that's how I see the truth telling working really well in our school setting, is our students listening mostly. They do ask questions, but it's mostly a listening. Yeah.
It sounds like the process you have in place really answers to the point that Heidi raised about the difference between knowing and hearing. And it sounds like your students are really hearing this, and because they're the messengers, at times their families and other connections are able to, adults in their lives are able to hear it too, in a way they might not otherwise be able to hear it.
Definitely.
If I was to ask, sorry, go ahead.
No, I just think just with that, as I said, like a shared history, but really different experiences. So I didn't experience, that can't be right. I didn't experience it like that when I grew up here. So hearing that other, and as Maree said in the findings, having that based on fact and on records, this is what actually happened. Like, this is what they've been told at school. So just maybe have a look at this. I think those dinner table conversations are really important to then get some of those parents and community members over the line to get to a truth telling event.
Yes, the paths are many and winding, aren't they, in the truth telling pathway? And so if I was to ask you, there's 1,900 people registered today, a lot of wanting to learn about some of the barriers and enablers of truth-telling, and are obviously interested in either participating in or initiating truth-telling processes themselves. Is there anything you could say just about the basic things you think people need to consider if they're going to either participate in or try to initiate a truth-telling process in their own communities?
Again, I think there are so many other brains on here that could answer this better than me, but I know you do want to hear it for someone on the ground. But
keeps it real. Keeps it real.
My first experience for myself personally was, how can I fix this? And I think that's not the headspace to enter into truth telling with. That's not what our community are expecting to be happening. It's more about the listening. The listening and the telling. I mean, it's in the word truth telling. It's about listening to what's being said, not trying to fix anything there and then in that space. Having possibly quite a neutral space where community still feels comfortable, but non-Indigenous people also feel is a space that they can share. I think spaces like community libraries might provide that, or the school setting if there's no trauma around that for people. So spaces that are community spaces and really neutral, where people possibly have accessed already. There's spaces that people have been in for something else. And there might be sort of little, I guess, taster sessions of truth telling at events that people are already attending. So I know a lot of the sporting clubs I'm involved in would be so happy to have those spaces on our Saturdays or Sundays, where people can sit and listen, or just be in that space and see different things that then follow on to a more in-depth, involved truth telling. So I think those small bites, like you said, a bit of a journey of seeing it a few different places and engaging a little bit at first and understanding that it's not a space that you're going to go into. A lot of the students that I spoke about when the summary came out and we spoke about it in class were saying, well, I don't know, do I go there? Is it going to be something where I'm feeling really guilty? And whilst it's not that at all, I guess trying to overcome that idea that it's just a space that you are going to sit in and you are just going to listen to a different history perhaps than what you've heard before. So that would probably be a summary of my suggestions.
Fantastic.
It's going to work everywhere, but it's working.
No, it's so helpful. And I think really when we speak to people who are actually doing it on the ground, we're presented with the big picture from Maree and Heidi and all the principles, but when you speak to someone who's doing it on the ground, it gets real, and that's when it can really help to add flesh to the story. It's looking like Uncle Gary has audio. Is that right, Uncle Gary?
That's correct. I'm sorry about that.
Yes.
Okay. You come the real gems now.
Thank you so much, Tess. And now, Uncle Gary, I am going to throw all the same questions at you. Please, can you tell us a little bit about the truth telling you've been doing and why you do it and the approaches you've had success with? I'll just open the mic to you.
Okay, thanks, Penny. First of all, I'd like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the lands we're all on today, our elders past, present and emerging, and to the people affected by the stolen generation legislation and practices, and particularly those that never made it home. I would like to say, as Gary Matthews, I am very sorry. To answer the discussion about local communities and truth-telling, it's really simple. It's really simple. If we don't acknowledge the past together, we can't go forward and acknowledge the future. It's that simple. We are made up of DNA of our past, especially Aboriginal people. We don't make this stuff up. We have lived it, we have walked it, we have seen it. So it's quite simple to have a meeting of respect, and I usually lead the truth-telling. I certainly have protocols in place that I won't tolerate or accept any non-truth discussions. And when I sit on local, state or national panels or at meetings, I do truth-telling, but I also do truth listening. It's important that I listen to people who don't know and explain to them what the truth is. I think in the findings that highlighted quite deeply that we have told previously the stories that have happened, and for some reason people don't think it's the truth. We don't make it up, we lived it, it is true. And that's why it's called truth-telling. I have protocols in place and I have expectations for our meetings, and I've been able to break down a lot of barriers between government speak and Aboriginal culture. And I've got to say, on a local level, the government speak is now being more government listening. They are starting to understand that their practices have affected us severely, and at this stage, they need to listen to what we say is best. We come to the table with different agendas, but when I lead the truth-telling, we leave the table sharing great knowledge and respect for our local history and what's happened and the effect it's had, especially in the welfare and the disability sectors. Community people, and I have many people from the stolen generation living in this community, and they will tell us the trauma 40, 50, 60 years later that they went through. We must listen to that. That is the truth.
Thanks, Uncle Gary. And I'm so glad we finally get to hear from you because of your rich experience. And I just wanted to ask you more specifically about some of the approaches you've found have really helped people to hear rather than just know. And perhaps you could just tell us a little bit more about some of those approaches so people can benefit from your experience.
Certainly. I think you need to be very consistent with truth-telling, truth listening. We as Aboriginal people have similar culture, but we come from different lands. And I make that point very clear when I'm having a discussion with anybody. If it's a local person asking me a local issue, just a community person or a volunteer in the street asking me a question, I can speak for where I come from the beautiful lands of the Gadigal people, the Eora Nation. But I will get advice from the Gumbaynggirr people on the North Coast where I come from. It is really important that we listen to local community people. Our elders certainly, but there is a lot of older people that have lived and walked the walk. And so the success we have is actually be able to listen. And we talk through our school systems, and we have made some significant changes in acknowledging that Aboriginal people are most welcome and should be treated as VIPs when they come into the school, not just during the NAIDOC time. I listen to questions asked of me, of people. I will tell them the truth, but I'm also willing to teach the truth. It's important to have integrity and to have the knowledge. It's the honesty that's the truth. It's not a guess, it's just the honesty.
Thanks, Uncle Gary. Now, unfortunately, we're running out of time and there is so much we could delve into in both of your experiences, but I'm going to have to leave it there. Thank you so much for joining us today and for sharing your insights and experience. And we're really grateful for your time and knowledge. Thank you.
Welcome.
I'll just quickly pass back to Heidi Norman in case she wants to make a few final remarks on behalf of the research team from University of New South Wales.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Penny. Thank you to you, Tess and Uncle Gary, for your comments on really from community perspective, how to engage people more actively in truth-telling. And what I heard particularly from both of you is the need, there were two things. One is that both of you emphasise the importance of supporting children, that this was a truth-telling is necessary for the health and well-being of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander children. And you also mentioned schools as really vital sites, because children, the opportunities for truth-telling that might present in schools also comes back to families. And so children go home and talk to their families, and so that has a cross-generational impact. And the other point you both raised really clearly is that the significance of local-based truth-telling. And I think, Tess, you raised that in thinking about in your part of the world, in the influence of the Kinchela Boys' Home as a site and as a place that has significance to your township, and their role in leading a lot of that truth-telling. And I think for you, Uncle Gary, you also mentioned that you are taking this very seriously and taking a lot of responsibility for leading and facilitating truth-telling. And so for both you, Uncle Gary, and thinking about the Kinchela Boys' Home as an example, we can see that there's enormous leadership and responsibility being taken for truth-telling amongst senior Aboriginal people. And we thank and acknowledge the work you are doing there. And finally, Penny, I just, you mentioned the article we published today in the conversation. It's available for free, and you can comment and engage with the ideas there. You might disagree with them, you might want to know more information, but that's a short sort of entry point to the research reports, and we will appreciate your ongoing feedback. And just finally, thank you again, Karen, and to Reconciliation Australia for supporting us to conduct this research. Thank you.
Thanks, Heidi. And that brings us to the close of this event with just a few thank you. So thank you, Heidi and Anne-Marie, for your tireless and skilled work in advancing this important research and for sharing its findings today. Thank you also to Professor Holt for your time and participation today. Thank you, Uncle Gary and Tess, for sharing your knowledge and experience in facilitating local level truth-telling. Thank you, Karen Mundine, for contextualising this research in the work to advance justice and reconciliation in this country. And thank you, of course, to the many participants in this research who have helped advance our collective understanding of truth-telling through giving your time and insights to this research. And finally, thank you to the University of New South Wales and particularly Maria Roberts for organising and running this webinar today in collaboration with the Reconciliation Australia comms team. And to all of you attending today, thank you. I urge you to read this report and learn from it and consider how you might advance truth-telling in your own community. It is available on the Reconciliation Australia website at reconciliation.org.au, and a recording of this webinar will also be available on the Reconciliation Australia website. And this brings our launch to an end, but the work of truth-telling continues, and hopefully after today, we will all feel a little more equipped to play our part in it. Thank you for joining us, and good afternoon.